Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special centenary historical lecture. My name is Paul Johnston. I'm the British Ambassador to Ireland, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here to Glencairn. This has been the British Ambassador's residence since the 1950s, and over the years it's been the stage for many important Glencairn Conversations on issues affecting the UK, Ireland and the wider world. Today we're here to consider an historical theme of great significance for UK-Ireland relations, including today. The 6th of December will be the 100th anniversary of the conclusion of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. The treaty, of course, marked a hugely important step in the constitutional settlement between the UK and Ireland, which emerged over the course of the 1910s and early 1920s. It was welcomed by some and seen as an act of statesmanship, a compromise to resolve centuries of tension and indeed conflict. The lead Irish negotiator, Arthur Griffiths, made his position clear after the signing of the treaty, when he said, "I have signed a treaty of peace between Ireland and Great Britain. I believe that the treaty will lay the foundations of peace and friendship between the two nations. What I have signed I shall stand by, in the belief that the end of the conflict of centuries is at hand." Equally, of course, the treaty was bitterly opposed by others in various jurisdictions for various reasons, not least within what became the Irish Free State. The treaty also had its opponents from a different perspective in Westminster, as a study of the parliamentary debates following its conclusions there will attest. More broadly, as I've read about this period and seeing the fantastic Colin Murphy play The Treaty, it's been clear how complex and how multifaceted the dynamics were at play. As someone myself who's done international negotiations in the UN and NATO, in the EU, and indeed bilaterally between Britain and other countries, you realise as you look at the history of the negotiations, all the factors that were there in the 1920s are there in the negotiations of today and of recent years. Domestic considerations, international dynamics, the aspects of military forces and their capability, the role of individual personalities within the delegations, across the delegations, coalition dynamics, even the influence of advisors. And I think we'll see that probably in our discussion today. In the midst of this maelstrom, and over the course of 2 months of intense and detailed negotiations in London, the final shape of the treaty emerged. And to look at that process and at that result, we are privileged today to have 3 outstanding historians on our panel to deepen our understanding of the treaty and of its context. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Caoimhe Nic Dormhaid. She's a senior lecturer in modern history at the University of Sheffield and a member of the Centenary Historical Advisory Panel, which is an independent panel of academics which has been advising the British government on historical matters pertaining to the centenary of Northern Ireland. After her keynote address, we'll hear a response from Dr. Martin Mansart. Martin is a historian, a former Irish government minister, and a senior advisor on the Northern Ireland peace process to successive Taoiseach. He's vice chair of the Expert Advisory Group on Centenary Commemorations, which advises the Irish government on historical matters relating to the decade of centenaries. And we'll also hear from Dr. Sinead McCool. Sinead is a historian and a curator of Mana 100, an initiative to document the role of women during the Irish revolutionary period of 1912 to 1923. And she is also a member of the Expert Advisory Group on Centenary Commemorations. I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to these 3 historians for taking part today. Thank you also to our in-person guests who are attending here. Many of you, I'm aware, are experts in your own rights, and so we're looking forward to a lively and robust Q&A session later on. And a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us here online for this lecture. It's going to be, I hope, and I'm sure, a fascinating discussion about a fascinating issue. And at the end of it, I hope we'll all have a greater, deeper shared understanding of a really important moment in the shared history of our islands. So Caoimhe, without further ado, let me hand over to you for the keynote lecture today.
Good morning. I'd like to thank the Ambassador Paul Johnston for the invitation to come and speak to you all this morning. And I'd also like to record my gratitude and appreciation to the Ambassador's staff here at Glencairn and at the British Embassy, particularly to Jeremy and Sharon, who have made everything run incredibly smoothly. So the most memorable phrase, I suggest, associated with the treaty signed in London 100 years ago was not technical stipulations around the treaty ports, nor even the precise wording of the controversial Oath of Allegiance. The most memorable phrase was the ultimatum or threat issued by the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George to the Irish delegation late on the night of the 5th of December. These words, immediate and terrible war, have seeped into the national consciousness in Ireland. This phrase appears in virtually every work of history written on the treaty, and indeed on every book on the War of Independence and the Civil War. It also features in popular culture. Ken Loach's The Wind That Shakes the Barley, that film from 2006, I think it was, features a confrontation scene between the two brothers, pro-treaty Teddy and anti-treaty Damien, where the phrase immediate and terrible war is used by Teddy to defend his decision to support the agreement. It also features in Walter Macon's The Scorching Wind, and his novel from 1964, the last of his trilogy, tracing the fortunes of an Irish family through 100 years of the struggle for Irish independence. Dominic and Dúilta were two brothers in this novel, also divided by the treaty. If the treaty was not signed, said Dúilta patiently, we would have been faced with an immediate and terrible war. That was their words. What had they been doing up to that? Playing tiddlywinks, retorted Dominic. So it is fair to say that this phrase has entered the Irish national lexicon. It recurs in various guises across Irish political life, and the historical Dáil debates throw up a few unexpected results when you put in the search term immediate and terrible war. It appears in a 1981 debate on Knock Airport. It appears during the wranglings over Irish beef exports in the midst of the BSE crisis. And it even crops up in the year 2000 to describe the attitude of the European Commission towards the Irish credit union movement. So the phrase is firmly lodged in the political vocabulary of independent Ireland. And as we can see from the above examples, it has evolved over time to be used as a light-hearted stick with which to beat political opponents. And it is used by parties on both sides of that treaty divide. And I should say, of course, it also appears on many other occasions in the Dáil record in a more serious manner, particularly during the 1930s and the 1940s, when that treaty was being gradually dismantled, particularly by the Eamon de Valera government. So it is lodged in our national vocabulary and forms part of the collective memory around the treaty in Ireland. It's not so evident on the British side, though. The phrase does not appear at all in Hansard, in the parliamentary debates surrounding the treaty. It crops up only obliquely in a debate on the Imminent Boundary Commission in 1924. Then, a Conservative MP, George Davies, noted that the effect of the supposed ultimatum had not been sufficiently realised on this side of the Channel. In musing on the Celtic temperament, to use his words, he suggested that the taking of an oath of loyalty in which there is a sense of unfairness or duress will always leave resentment or revolt. That duress is regarded by many in Ireland as having created the greater part of the difficulties of the present day. So what was this ultimatum and how did it come about? And these are the issues that I want to explore in this talk, along with considering to what extent it was a genuine threat or a mere bluff, as some have suggested. And I will finish by exploring what paying more attention to immediate and terrible war does for our understanding of the dynamics of the treaty itself and the long-term evolution of Anglo-Irish relations. So this was the climactic event in the dramatic final days of the negotiations of the treaty, which had been ongoing in early December 1921 for 8 exhausting weeks in Downing Street. On the night of the 5th of December, David Lloyd George demanded to know if the Irish delegation would sign the draft document. He waved 2 letters in front of them, one of which was to be sent to the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, James Craig, that very evening. Would it be the first letter, with news of a negotiated settlement and details of the Articles of Agreement, or the second, which meant war within 3 days? Immediate and terrible was the gloss put on David Lloyd George's words by Robert Barton, one of the plenipotentiaries who did reluctantly agree to sign. So 2 versions of the same text. A strategy more familiar to some of us than others, perhaps, but it was an effective negotiating tactic. And as we know, it paid off. Despite the very serious reservations of Barton and George Gavin Duffy in particular, all of the Irish delegates signed the draft treaty at shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning of the 6th of December. But this ultimatum had not come out of nowhere. The prospect of a breakdown in negotiations had loomed over the talks almost from the outset. Lloyd George was fond of snapping, "Then it means war," at moments of high tension, interspersed with cajoling, bonhomie, jokes, or stern finger-wagging. So they had heard these sorts of threats before. The negotiations leading up to the treaty were conducted, of course, in the context of a truce, a temporary cessation of hostilities declared on the 11th of July 1921. And as such, the prospect of a return to hostilities, should the negotiations fail, was, on the surface at least, always in the background. Indeed, this was in part how Michael Collins and his fellow IRA GHQ leaders had sold the truce to IRA commanders, who were surprised when the order to cease their operations came out of the blue, as it were, to them in the summer. So the truce, as it was explained to some of the more belligerent IRA commanders, would allow the Republican movement much needed breathing space from increasingly effective operations mounted by Crown forces, particularly the British Army. It would also allow the IRA to regroup, to continue recruitment, to boost training, and especially to try and secure reliable sources of weaponry. Guns and ammunition were running perilously low by that summer, and during the truce, GHQ stepped up efforts intensively to bring in guns from America and from the continent, especially from Germany, as recent work by Brian Hanley has shown. On the British side, the truce was greeted with mixed feelings. Crown forces had been suffering record losses in the months leading up to the truce, in part the result of renewed IRA military activity, but June 1921 had seen a large expansion in military numbers in Ireland, rising by 33% in the space of a month. And there were also, as Charles Townsend has argued, signs of innovations in counterinsurgency tactics. In particular, the establishment of British Army mobile units to counter the IRA's famous flying columns. But the raw numbers of increasing troop figures obscures the true picture. It took newly arrived troops considerable time to adjust to Irish conditions. Those who had been in Ireland for some months were in urgent need of recuperative leave, and the long simmering problem of whether the police or the army should have primacy in tackling the IRA was reaching a head in that summer of 1921. Notwithstanding the conciliatory overtures in the speech of King George V at the opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament on the 22nd of May, the previous day, the Lord Chancellor, Lord Birkenhead, one of the delegation, the British government delegation in 1921, the previous day he had made a speech in the House of Lords where he strongly implied that new methods would be forthcoming to deal with what he belatedly recognised was a small war. That was unusual. The British side did not favour using the term war to describe the conflict in Ireland, but in May 1921, Lord Birkenhead did. So you have conciliatory speech by the King on the 22nd of May, a hostile, slightly more forceful speech made by Lord Birkenhead, the Lord Chancellor, on the 21st of May. And this apparent contradiction at the heart of government policy, conciliation, coercion, was in fact a deliberate strategy and had been for at least 9 months. Reach out to moderates in Sinn Féin while continuing to press and harry the IRA. And so the sequencing of Birkenhead's intervention in the Lords with the King's speech at Belfast is perhaps more of a piece with that overall strategy than historians have recognised. But it should be remembered that the extremely slow progress of the negotiations was not entirely expected. Initially, it was believed that the talks between the Irish government and the Irish delegation, the actual talks would last 2 to 3 weeks. In fact, it took 6 weeks to even bring talks about talks to an end, to even find an agreed basis for a formal conference. And it was almost 9 weeks from the declaration of the truce before the formal negotiations opened. And this delay had serious implications for the IRA's capabilities, despite what Collins and Richard Mulcahy had been telling IRA commanders back in July. Despite the surge in IRA recruits, training the raw Truceliers, as they were rather dismissively known, was not easy. And there you have a photograph taken from an IRA training camp in the summer of 1921. And there are many such photographs because it wasn't easy to photograph flying columns during the period of the hostilities. So many of the formal photographs of IRA units that we have actually date from this period of the truce. Keeping even seasoned volunteers occupied and maintaining discipline, morale and readiness for action was even harder. There were only so many trenches in roads that you could fill in, and more volunteers meant more men to arm, which in turn increased the pressure on arms importation missions in Hamburg, Germany and Liverpool. And reports of breaches of the truce filtered through sporadically and created potentially serious problems for the continuation of the negotiations. The Irish, Lloyd George charged in late October, were prolonging the negotiations merely as a cover for their arms importation efforts. And this was not entirely groundless. He wasn't entirely wrong about that. Both sides were anticipating that the talks would in fact fail. The great question was, on which hurdle would they break down? Would it be over the question of sovereignty or unity? Would it be on the Republic or would it be on a united Ireland? Would it be over the Empire or whether it would be over Ulster? Now, I'm not going to rehearse the to's and fro's of the negotiations themselves. There are a great many excellent books that do that, not least the classic Peace by Ordeal, by Lord Longford, followed by Ronan Fanning's Fatal Path, another excellent book, 2 recently published books, The Treaty by Gretchen Friedman and Midnight in London, which is forthcoming by Colm Kenny. But I do want to suggest that the occasion of this anticipated break, sovereignty or unity, was significant in understanding how any possible return to war would play out. In the British Cabinet conclusions of the 7th of September 1921, so before the formal negotiations had even begun, it was made clear that it would not be possible to maintain public support for the British government's position if breakdown came over Ulster and especially over Fermanagh and Tyrone. Whereas if the break came over loyalty to the throne and the empire, public support would be more easily assured. 2 months later, Neville Macready, the General Officer Commanding-in-Chief of the British Army in Ireland, wrote to Sir Henry Wilson, the Longford-born Chief of the Imperial General Staff, that it would be insane to go to war merely if Ulster objects to a plebiscite in Fermanagh and Tyrone. The British strategy, therefore, was to ensure that if a break would come, it would come over questions of sovereignty, specifically whether and to what extent the new Irish state would formally pledge allegiance to the Crown. This was partly a calculation on the preponderance of domestic and international public opinion, but it was also about internal political rivalries, both liberal and conservative. Lord George's position at the head of a coalition government, liberal and conservative, with an enormous 249-seat majority, appears deceptively secure. There you see Lord George leaving Downing Street with 2 leading members of his cabinet, Winston Churchill on the right and Lord Birkenhead there in the middle. So Lord George is a Liberal Prime Minister in a Conservative-dominated coalition. The great offices of state were all held by Conservatives: Foreign Secretary, Lord Chancellor, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and by 1921, Secretary of State for War. And although Lord George had won a stunning personal victory at the polls, the speed with which he was ultimately dispatched by his coalition allies in October 1922 suggests that he was less beloved of his MPs than he was of the country at large. The coalition government was thus vulnerable to attacks from both sides. Asquithian Liberals, the formal opposition, so the formal Liberal Party still led by the former Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, they had been especially critical of the reprisals policy adopted by Crown forces and tolerated, if not officially sanctioned, at the highest level of government. In November 1920, the former Prime Minister Asquith read into Hansard, quote, evidence accumulating in increasing volume ever since that the forces of the Crown in various parts of the country step by step came to be engaged in systematic raids upon towns and villages and in the deliberate destruction of creameries, factories, shops, dwelling houses, farms and farm produce without any kind of discrimination and without any regard to the presumed innocence or guilt of the owners or occupiers or even the local community to which they belong. Liberals had attempted votes of censure on the government during the War of Independence for the reprisals policy while maintaining their condemnation of the Sinn Féin murder gang. And you see Asquith in that cartoon there on the left-hand side. For their part, the British Labour Party had sent a special commission to investigate allegations of state reprisals in Ireland, publishing an official report in the spring of 1921 detailing their findings, including witness statements and photographs of army brutality. So the coalition government was quite vulnerable to criticism on its liberal flank, or left liberal flank. And George Boyce's classic Englishmen and Irish Troubles reminds us that British public opinion was profoundly disturbed at the lurid reports of burnings and shootings from Ireland, and not for the first time bringing colonial counterinsurgency techniques back into the metropole of sorts was the source of much disquiet. But the government was also alert to danger on the right. The diehards had emerged as a troublesome conservative backbench faction after the 1911 election, and Irish policy was the issue that exercised them the most. Opposed to Home Rule before the war, after the war, they were adamant on the need to avoid treating with terrorists and hyper-vigilant for any sniff of betrayal of Ulster. Conservative cabinet members in particular were becoming worried about the return to public life of Andrew Bonar Law, who had been absent with a period of ill health. Oh, thought I had a slide of Bonar Law. Known for his absolute support of unionism, Bonar Law was a powerful figure outside of government, a possible focus to coalesce around. Simmering discontent came to a head when the diehards tried to vote a force of censure on the government for its Irish policy at the end of October 1921, even before the negotiations had really begun to gain ground. In the end, with Ulster Unionists abstaining, the rebellion was easily crushed, but the danger remained. So you have attempted votes of censure coming from both sides of the British political divide. In his long speech to Parliament, on the occasion of that attempted diehard vote of censure in October, at the end of October 1921, Lord George spoke quite frankly about what the return to war would mean. I'm going to read out a long quote. It would mean numbers entirely out of proportion to the number of your opponent. You have to surround them, hunt down small, elusive bands over very considerable tracts of territory, a good deal of it over highly difficult mountainous country where your population is entirely in sympathy with your guerrillas. Those who had experience of the South African War know what that means. Every farmer depot and an observation post, every resident supplying information and giving warning to those attacking the forces of the Crown. We all know how gigantic were the forces that had to be put in South Africa in order to accomplish our task. If it has to be done, and if the people of this country are convinced it must be done, it can be done and it will be done. Cheers. There will be unpleasant incidents. One of the evils of guerrilla warfare is that your forces are dispersed and are not under the same control and discipline as when employed in masses. I feel that before you ask people to pay for war and men to risk their lives, you must first convince the people of the country that there is no other course. You must convince the Empire. We must convince ourselves that there is no alternative. But privately, after making that quite bellicose speech, privately, Lord George told his his private secretary, Tom Jones, just days later, that he would not be party to firing another shot in the south of Ireland. I have told the king. And this is an interesting statement, somewhat ambiguous. He would not be party to firing another shot in the south. Note that he specifies the south and not the north. I'm quite interested in that statement. Part of creating the narrative around there being no alternative, I suggest, was bringing negotiations to break on the question of empire or allegiance to the crown, an issue that was far more likely to rally popular and political support than the famous dreary steeples. But by this stage, the British government were drawing up contingency plans. The previous week, the Secretary of State for War had drawn up orders to prepare for the eventuality, what seemed to be the likelihood, that talks would fail. And it makes for quite sobering reading. The document is in the National Archives in Kew, available to view online. It anticipated martial law immediately across the 26 counties, a massive propaganda campaign, recruitment of an additional 85,000 ex-servicemen, as well as an additional Ulster division, reinforced security across Britain in anticipation of renewed attacks there, press censorship, proscribing all Republican organisations, the introduction of ID cards in Ireland, closing all ports except for Cork and Dublin, requiring passports to travel between Ireland and Britain, making possession of arms a capital offence, suspension of civil courts and introduction of field court martials, restrictions on the export of Irish produce, the stoppage of fairs, markets, race meetings, etc. We shall be on the offensive, the memo concluded, from the moment martial law is declared. And ominously, the rebels would be dealt with by military rather than police methods. Clearly a very serious set of contingency planning, but what's perhaps interesting in its absence from this scenario planning is any preparations to use air power, then being used to decisive effect in Mesopotamia. So clearly there are some lines which were not being contemplated to be crossed. For their part, the Irish delegation were similarly alive to the need to control the narrative and be in the best possible position should the negotiations fail. Although the degree to which the plenipotentiaries had full formal instructions from Dublin remains a vexed issue, not to mention the confusion engendered by their status as full plenipotentiaries or not quite full plenipotentiaries. That's before you add in the troubled issue of external association, which none of the delegation appeared to fully understand. The Irish delegation, in turn, did try to force the break on Ulster rather than the Crown or the Empire. And this was in line with their instructions from Dublin. And I am convinced, as are other historians, that De Valera's strategy was to force a break on Ulster, to have the negotiations collapse before he came in to revive them and extract more favourable terms all around. De Valera was gambling that a return to war would not be immediate, even though it might be terrible. But as we know, Lloyd George spotted a gap on his part when Griffith agreed to a boundary commission, and then that he would not personally break with the Prime Minister on Ulster. Griffith, it seems, believed that this would give Lord George more scope to pressure the Craig government, but as we know, Griffith's calculation was wrong. Some of the newspapers greeting the signing of the treaty. Now, once the fateful ultimatum had been delivered and the treaty agonisingly signed, the idea that it had been signed under duress loomed very large in the public and political debate that followed. In the final cabinet meeting before the 6th of December, Griffith had promised not to sign anything before submitting it to the Dáil and, if necessary, to the people. So the fact that this pledge had been overturned just a couple of days later formed a large part of the recriminations that followed in the cabinet and indeed within the Dáil. In the treaty debates, there you have the crowd outside the building, university buildings on Earlsfort Terrace, watching the TDs go in, anxious to have news of the debates outside. During the debates, Collins, for his part, was keen to emphasise that he did not sign the treaty under duress, except in the sense that the position as between Ireland and England historically has always been one of duress. And he felt that talk of immediate and terrible war was a red herring because Britain has not made a declaration of war upon Egypt, nor has she made a declaration of war upon India, but is the conflict there any less terrible because of the absence of such declaration? But Collins was alone amongst the Irish delegation in denying that that threat had been influential. Robert Barton gloomily pointed out that an answer that was not unanimous committed you to terrible war, and the responsibility for that was to rest directly on those 2 delegates who refused to sign. For myself, I preferred war. I told my colleagues so, but for the nation, without consultation, I dared not accept that responsibility. George Gavin Duffy put it more emotively. We who were sent to London as the apostles of peace, the qualified apostles of peace, were suddenly to be transformed into the unqualified arbiters of war. That we had to make this choice within 3 hours and to make it without any reference to our cabinet, to our parliament, or to our people. And that monstrous iniquity was perpetrated by the man who had invited us under his roof in order, Maria, to make a friendly settlement. So that the position was this, that if we, every one of us, did not sign and undertake to recommend, fresh hordes of savages would be let loose upon this country to trample and torture and terrify it. And whether the Cabinet, Dáil Éireann, or the people of Ireland willed war or not, the iron heel would come down upon their heads with all the force which a last desperate effort at terrorism could impart to it. We lost the Republic of Ireland in order to save the people of Ireland. So why is it that Collins was the only one to reject the claim that immediate and terrible war had played any part in his decision to sign? Well, I think it is about his dual role, unique among the plenipotentiaries, as a soldier statesman. The other were all politicians, and we know that Collins and his retinue had been scornful, distant and suspicious of the politicians, preferring to rent their own house rather than join with the secretary's typists and bridge playing at Hans Place. Collins was sensitive to perceived slights on his manhood, declaring in a later debate on the treaty, I, as an individual, do not now, no more than ever, shirk war. The treaty was signed by me not because they held up the alternative of immediate war. I signed it because I would not be one of those to commit the Irish people to war without the Irish people committing themselves to war. If my constituents send me to represent them in war, I will do my best to represent them in war. So he was quite keen to emphasise that he wasn't afraid of war personally. He just didn't want to commit the Irish people to war unless they had indicated that they wanted it. Other speakers on both sides of the treaty divide also dwelt on the question of threat and duress. Kevin O'Higgins made great mileage out of the immediate and terrible war theme, declaring that it would have been criminal madness to subject the people of Ireland to war for the shadow of a difference between the treaty and between De Valera's proposals, the famous document number 2, which might have carried the entire cabinet. Some on the pro-treaty side pointed to Lloyd George's warnings back in October in the House of Commons of what a return to war would mean. William Sears, TD, conjured up the image of a British march through Georgia like Sherman when he burned every town and village and haggard on his path. You would have 32 Shermans marching through Ireland for the difference between this treaty and document number 2. Liam Mellows, opposing the treaty, declared that no war the British government initiated here could be worse than the terrible mental strain imposed on the people during the last 18 months. Mary McSweeney was adamant that it was a bluff, but that even so she would still reject the treaty. This matter has been put to us as the treaty or war. I say now, if it were war, I would take it gladly and gleefully, not flippantly, but gladly, because I realise that there are evils worse than war, and that no physical victory can compensate for a spiritual surrender. But I deny that the alternative is war, as I deny that the alternative would have been war on the night of the 5th of last December. And I just want to finish by quoting a TD Frank Fahey. In his speech, he questioned the implications of signatures under duress. The delegates stated one and all that this treaty does not meet the nation's demand and that they so voted because they believed the alternative to be a war of extermination. 'Tis hard to blame the war-weary people for clamouring for peace. But it should be clearly put on record that such votes are given under duress. Can a treaty based on fear, naked and unashamed, be a sound basis for friendship between the two peoples? It is my opinion that lasting peace and friendship between the two peoples was feasible as we stood on December 5th. Whether such peace is practicable now is at least questionable. So I'm going to come to a conclusion. Was the threat of war a bluff? The late and eminent historian Ronan Fanning has described this as a meaningless debate on whether Lord George was bluffing. All that mattered was that, bluff or not, it worked. But for me, it's not a meaningless debate. These were real choices and real possibilities that faced the delegation in circumstances of immense strain. Taking seriously the threat, implied or explicit, of war means taking seriously the contingencies of history, with all the multiple possibilities that exist, possible futures that existed at any moment in time. I think it's likely that Lord George would have resigned or would have been pushed aside if the negotiations had collapsed entirely. As Charles Townsend has noted, Lord George was pinning his entire political career on the Irish negotiations. His secretary, Tom Jones, admitted in his private diary that war would mean failure, the failure of their entire political project. Birkenhead, too, told Collins and Griffith in early November that Lord George would resign rather than use force against Ireland, and Griffith certainly believed throughout the negotiations that the coalition government could fall by the end of the year. So does this mean they should have recognised the threat as a bluff? What was the likely scenario if Lord George had resigned? Well, the person who became Prime Minister in October 1922 would likely have done so 10 months earlier, Andrew Bonar-Law, darling of Unionists and diehards whose baleful shadow had loomed in the background of the negotiations. This too was what the Irish delegation were expecting. Griffith wrote to De Valera in November 1922 that if the coalition government fell, Bonar-Law would form a militarist government against Ireland. Although the expected Bonar-Law leadership challenge to Birkenhead didn't, in fact, materialise while the negotiations unfolded, it did have the effect of prompting all senior Conservatives to reiterate their opposition to any coercion of Ulster. So there's all sorts of levels of political calculations at play when we go back to that night of the 5th and 6th of December. Is this the best possible deal that can be done at this particular moment? Is this the best possible deal that can be done with this particular team on the opposite side of the negotiating tables? If we say no here, what are the likely sequence of events? Who will we be facing next week or next month across the negotiating table? So some might argue that it's just another form of realpolitik. In making that threat, I mean, this is partly what Collins was suggesting in that speech I quoted from earlier. In making the ultimatum, Lloyd George was merely voicing what everyone knew would be the case. But it is a moment where the power negotiations at play in the negotiations are laid bare, where the power dynamics at play are laid bare. And it also means, I think, that we should take more seriously the anti-treaty arguments around where democratic legitimacy lay in 1922, 23 and thereafter. The comfortable old binaries of Democrats versus dictators in the treaty split during the Civil War don't really hold up, I don't think, once you take the threat of war or the belief that there had been a threat of war more seriously. It might also change how we view the treaty as an international agreement. If one side reluctantly agreed to sign only after an ultimatum had been issued. And you see here on the slide some of the political cartoons which circulated in the months after the treaty. The one on the right in particular is interesting. It is by Grace Plunkett, the widow of Joseph Mary Plunkett. But as it turned out, this charge or this claim that the treaty had been signed under duress was actually politically very useful for successive Irish governments in the decades after. Fianna Fáil made much hay of it as they progressively dismantled the various provisions of the Articles of Agreement after 1932. It was a powerful moral answer to the challenge of reneging on international treaty obligations. This treaty had been imposed under duress, therefore it didn't have a firm legitimate basis, therefore there was no moral responsibility to adhere to it. In any case, the developments in Commonwealth jurisprudence since 1929 further loosed the fetters of December 1921. And notwithstanding the bumpy period of the economic war of the 1930s, when retaliatory tariffs were imposed on trade coming east-west and west-east, and the strange circumstances of Irish neutrality during the Second World War, only possible, of course, because of the return of the treaty ports in 1938, Anglo-Irish relations proved remarkably capacious, able to accommodate the step-by-step approach to Irish independence signalled by Collins in the debates in January 22 and enacted by De Valera thereafter. For all of the fury unleashed by the threat of war, it remained a really effective negotiating ploy, perhaps most of all because it psychologically cleared a space for the Irish delegation to sign the treaty. Of course, the immediate and terrible war that was ultimately unleashed as a result of the treaty was the Irish Civil War, but that's a story for another day. Thank you.
Ambassador, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the Ambassador Paul Johnston for his hospitality and for his initiative in offering Glencairn Conversations as a British Embassy contribution to the Decade of Centenary's events. Both respondents, Dr. Sinead McCool and myself, are members of the government's expert advisory group on centenary commemorations, chaired by Dr. Maurice Manning, which has the task of trying to steer a path through an historic period where sensitivities from many angles abound. In the rest of what I have to say, I will be speaking for myself. The excellent lecture by Dr. Nidavid focuses on the significance of 4 words uttered by Lloyd George on the evening of 5th of December 1921, underlining the alternative of immediate and terrible war, which was the catalyst for the signature of the treaty by the Irish and British delegates in the early morning of the 6th of December. The threat made a particular impression on one of the delegates, Robert Barton, a Republican from the old Anglo-Irish ruling class. Though he disliked the treaty, unlike his more inflexible cousin Erskine Childers, he did not want someone of his background to be responsible for the human consequences of rejecting it. Of course, Lloyd George was being theatrical and was a past master of negotiating ploys and gambits with a mixed record of success. The underlying reality was that only a few weeks before the truce, plans were advanced to flood Ireland with troops and to take draconian measures, including 1916-style court-martials against the leaders of the independence movement. A similar threat had been issued to the Germans if they did not sign the Treaty of Versailles, including its humiliating clauses, the difference, of course, being that the Germans had been defeated. It has to be assumed that if negotiations had failed, the Irish side would have been blamed and the response would have been punitive. As Cueva points out, Lloyd George regularly reminded all his Irish interlocutors that the alternative to a successful negotiation was war. But privately, as again she has cited, Lloyd George recognised the difficulties even a vastly superior army faced in difficult and unfamiliar terrain, which has been demonstrated again and again in different countries in the century since, right up to the middle of this year. And of course, the related problem Burke pointed out in his famous speech on conciliation with America, that a country conquered has to be kept conquered. A renewed trial of force was therefore not plain sailing from a British point of view. If it had been, there would have been no truce. One can argue, of course, that first the Cabinet in Dublin and then the Dáil had to ratify the Articles of Agreement, the latter not under an immediate time constraint, but both had been presented with facts not easy to undo. There is always a danger with politically resonant phrases. It is argued to this day that the threat of force undermined the legitimacy of the treaty as a freely chosen Irish course, and that has had consequences far beyond the early 1920s. The term treaty, used at Irish request, was not strictly accurate, And a bit like calling its successor in 1998 the Good Friday Agreement, again at Irish behest, was designed to encourage public acceptance. The British insisted subsequently on the sacrosanct nature of the treaty engagements, so it might as well have been a treaty. While being invited to negotiate in Downing Street with the British government at the highest level was a big advance in terms of recognition, once there, the Irish side were at a negotiating disadvantage, irrespective of whether De Valera led them in person or not. This is because they were a revolutionary counter-government not recognised by any state internationally. Unfortunately, sharp differences about the extent of compromise required to make peace were never hammered out at home, allowing Lloyd George not just to split open the independence movement, but to put the Free State side in the invidious position where, however reluctantly, they had to enforce on their former comrades retraction of the Republic declared in 1916 and 1919. As against the issues, the political power struggle, very typical of independence movements, also needs to be analysed closely. The Irish case in regard to status was mainly based on principle and what was happening in Europe at the end of the First World War. Lloyd George argued instead pragmatic power politics, telling the Irish delegates, I quote, "The politician who thinks he can deal out abstract justice without reference to forces around him cannot govern." The British made their concession of what they chose to call Dominion Home Rule at the outset, which fudged two quite different concepts to disguise the fact that they were conceding what would become independence. Bonar Law gave the game away in March 1920 when he rejected the idea in the debate on the Government of Ireland Bill on the grounds that, quote, "Dominion Home Rule means the right to decide their own destinies." Lloyd George was having to manage a still expanding empire in a state of evolution and also trying to hold together a conservative-dominated coalition, being harried by the diehards to whom Cuiver and other historians are now paying more attention. In the longer term, De Valera's ill-understood external association came into its own and was of great interest to Asian countries on the threshold of independence after the Second World War. Membership of the Commonwealth was supposed to be voluntary. It wasn't for Ireland. The sight of Barbados becoming a republic last week but remaining in the Commonwealth shows the distance travelled in 100 years. In 1922, Republicans paid too much attention to symbols, not enough to realities. Dublin Unionist Vice President of the defunct, once powerful local government board, Sir Henry Robinson, ruefully admitted that the difference between a republic and actual administrative relations between Britain and Ireland was largely one of phraseology. Quote, "For in truth, Ireland has shaken off England completely and there is no use blinking the fact." Strident clauses inserted about the king being the executive power in the Free State, the oath with knobs on in the Constitution, made no difference. Unfortunately, the character of the independence struggle from 1916 till 1923 often gave the military and paramilitary primacy over elected politicians, which has taken a long time to exorcise from this island completely, although the Civil War here provided an object lesson. I agree with Cuiver that commitment to democracy, while invoked by both sides, left much to be desired and had to be painfully rebuilt. The Irish side also had something to hide, the hard reality of partition despite lip service to the essential unity of Ireland. Sean McEntee made a prescient speech entirely devoted to partition in the treaty debate, dismissing the idea that it would be temporary or that Northern Ireland would economically collapse. On the contrary, he likened its future to being similar to that of the Rock of Gibraltar. So I quite understand why historians have sort of knocked the the notion that the treaty split was primarily about partition, but I think there is a certain exaggeration that it was barely mentioned at all, the treaty debate, and I think that Sean McEntee's speech really needs to be read and paid much more attention to, as it was so prescient. The ill-judged and counterproductive attempt to destabilise Northern Ireland in 1922 does not support the idea that Collins trusted the Boundary Commission, whatever he might have said in public. And while partition initially seemed a great success from an Ulster Unionist point of view, time would show the disadvantages of trying to govern an unreconciled 35% of the population. Thank you.
Thank you. Gurv Mahagud, thank you, Ambassador Johnston, for the invitation to speak to mark the centenary of the signing of the Articles of Agreement for a treaty between Great Britain and Ireland. Distinguished speakers, our keynote, Dr. Caoimhín David, Dr. Martin Manzer, ladies and gentlemen, I want to also acknowledge the attendance in particular of the descendants of the participants at these events, and I welcome the opportunity to meet with you on this historic day. When one is asked to speak, your talk becomes bespoke, a place and a time. Normally the action of speaking is really intimate. You share the room, you have a select audience, sometimes the people travel a long way to hear you speak. I speak here today in the British Ambassador's residence in Dublin, knowing that the talk is being recorded and it will reach maybe far beyond this place and far beyond this time. Glencairn Conversations, to discuss events of 100 years ago and the 100 years in between. I do so, of course, with this full knowledge and understanding of what happened over those 100 years, especially here in this place in Glencairn. It's been my privilege to be at the heart of the government centenary's programme, and currently curating, as been described, the department's Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sports and Media online multimedia resource, Mino100.ie. And I suppose as a member of the expert advisory group for the Decadent Centenaries, and the Vice Chair and Chair are here with us today, I suppose I'd like to reach out to both of them and say it's been my privilege to be on a committee with you over this period in time. Both of you have had experience being at the table, making real history, as well as deliberating on history. So thank you both very much for your influence on me. So I'd like to talk to Dr. David, who we've been very fortunate to speak on the same panel for UCC, where we were talking about negotiating the negotiations. And I spoke in that session on the Anglo-Irish Treaty and I called the talk, Did the Women Have an Influence? I looked in that particular talk at Constance Demarkovich and also at Mary McSweeney and their selection, their non-selection for part of the those discussions, and how they, by not being there when women are asked to debate and not negotiate, they take a different line than if they're asked to go into that realm. And so I think that both of them should be looked at in the context of what they would have done if they'd been at the negotiations. But that's the what-if history in some ways. And so today I wanted to really respond to, obviously, to what Dr. David has said, and to respond to the idea of the term, the terrible and immediate war. So each time I toned my response, my mind defaulted to race memory. What a terrible and immediate war meant to David Lloyd George, and what it meant for each of the Teachtaí Dálaí who were asked to consider the Articles of Agreement between Great Britain and Ireland, asked to vote for and against, and where that led to. So a recurring theme within those debates signing the document, of course, was the 700 years of war that had gone before, Anglo-Irish relations, and trust and lack thereof. So if I may have a personal reflection, and I deliberated on whether I should have a personal reflection in this response, and to look at the word treaty. I can say to all of you in this room and beyond that I can say with absolute certainty that my first understanding of the word treaty went along with the word broken. I come from a town, I grew up in a place which was known as the city of the broken treaty, Limerick. For those of you who are unfamiliar, I'm going to go one step further. We were brought as children to a square-shaped rock on a plinth on a pedestal. At the backdrop was King John's Castle. As one kid once wrote in a little comment, which I thought was really great, when they were asked to say what their experience of being at King John's Castle was. And the child wrote, King John never lived here. I thought that was super. I've never forgotten it. And then so you can imagine the King John's Castle and then the backdrop across the River Shannon. And what were we told by the teacher? The treaty was broken before the ink was even dry. Imagine, we in school had just graduated to the use of ink to write, a big step up from the pencil. So it stayed with me, the speed of the ink drying, the swift prevail that had happened in 1691, almost 300 years before my childhood. Race memory, against the backdrop of the constant radio reporting of the Troubles. So there was a somewhat different structure in the talks of 1922, as Martin has already made the point about it being the Articles of Agreement versus the treaty. It was a series of negotiations. We haven't mentioned the July negotiations that led to October, which ties in with the idea of what was De Valera's plan, the ability to create a provisional government, the fact that it wouldn't happen the law wouldn't come into another year, the 6 months that were to shape events, brought everything, as we know, in a different direction, and may have brought them in the direction of document number 2, but that's not what happened. So when I think of immediate and terrible war, I think of brinkmanship. Was it really a declaration of war? I suppose I will go a little bit further into what Dr. David has talked about in her speech and confirm with my own sources, slightly different ones again. And I'm very grateful to Paul Johnston for alerting me to these sources. These were in-house private secret army documents that are about the reoccupation of Ireland that continue back and forth in April and June, and I can go into a little bit more detail if we have it in question and answers. And obviously we know of the, underscored constantly by the military service pension record, the number of members of IRA and Cumann na mBan who continued as normal during the truce and indeed, used the opportunity to train and amass weapons. I want to, as Dr. David has referred to, the 2 new books that are on the treaty. They are popular histories of Midnight in London and the treaty. And I suppose I'm here today in response, and the reason that I want to talk particularly about strategy, then it brings me to my work on the Laverys, in particular my work on a biography of Lady Lavery, and I note that the ambassador, unlike me, has had an opportunity to see the treaty play, and I understand from Jeremy, who I was speaking to earlier, that it refers to the relationship between Lady Lavery and Michael Collins, of course loosely based on the gossip at the time and my own work. I'd like to say that most of the time, if you look at the Twitter exchanges, which is supposedly quote and make conclusions from my work, that they're rather eliding hypotheses, are based on the more the gossip than the actual work. My thesis, written 30 years ago, remains unpublished. So I published a popularised biography of Lady Lavery, written for the popular history market. I'd just like to say that I've just found really 3 decades on that there's more of an academic credibility to the work that I did for my master's thesis that there ever was in the period in between. And it brings me directly to the whole concept of the strategy that was talked about in particular in relation to Birkenhead. I suppose what I would say is that was the reality of of the immediate and terrible war any more convincing than what people were saying in London gossip at the time, that Lavery's were responsible for bringing about persuading Michael Collins to visit Lloyd George and sign the treaty. What was said about them at the time was the power of the petticoat. But I suppose to understand Sir John Lavery, 1856 to 1941, the Belfast-born artist, and his wife, American Hazel Lady Lavery, 1880 to 1935, in the events leading up to the Articles Agreements for a treaty between the United Kingdom and Ireland, it is important to understand their unique position. The couple occupied in London society, their friendships with everyone from the Ascots to the Londonderrys to the people that were part of the delegation, and they maintained a popularity and a celebrity that seemed effortless through all of their what would seem almost questionable friendships. But indeed, when I was speaking very recently to Churchill's grandson, he spoke with their family's real affection for the Laverys. And so what I would say that when we're talking about these private and public discourses, and I'm mindful of journalists in the audience, the idea of what ends up for public consumption, what Ambassador is the private negotiations that ends up in the rooms of this very building. So I suppose I wanted to talk about, if I may, and I'm just mindful of time because I have now gone off script, is that I wanted to refer to archives and the importance of the primary document. I suppose I wanted to actually sort of bring out, particularly for the Q&A, is that it's so important when we see these type of books. And again, the use of the reference to the Lavery, I won't go into the detail here within in this book, again diminishes what I'm going to talk about this strategy. But I'm very mindful, as I do working outside academia, that I work in public history, that when you lose the complexity and when you lose the detail for consumption by the general public, the result is misinformation or a different history that lacks a degree of clarity at times in order for its simplification. So the private archive that I am going to talk about now, I believe that I'm the first Irish historian to be given access by Director Tony P. O'Connor, and I acknowledge his generosity in sharing this document with you today. The Lloyd George Archive is held in Godalming in Surrey. The bulk of the collection comes from the files of Colonel George Julian Scoville, CBE, General Secretary of Lord George's Coalition, Liberal Party Organisational Headquarters, and of course he was the man who brought about the National Liberal Party. So of course, because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to actually go and see this archive. I understand that the Scoville's collection is about 4,000 documents. I went on the trail of the Laverys, and to date, what's been located in the archive is a photograph. That's not really a surprise because John was a Liberal, but what's interesting about it is that it's the same thing with the Laverys, the non-documentation. The focus of my thesis originally was salon politics. So I'm going to quote from you a letter, just as I said, for the day that it is, and it's a letter to Lieutenant Colonel J. Reed Hyde, CBE, to the Taj Mahal Hotel, Bombay, on the 10th of March, 1920, and it is a copy that was kept. So you will be interested to hear that our old friend Stephen Gwynn has written an article in Everyman supporting the government bill for Ireland. It is quite an unexpected move on his part. I've been bombarded by Irish men on the inequities of the present bill, but I've always pointed out that there is no use trying to rush the British people. They had far better accept with certain amendments and modifications which they may obtain a scheme which is in advance of anything that has hitherto been formulated, and which has the foundation on which can be superimposed a dominion or any other form of home rule in the course of time. It is really a question of their playing their cards well and gaining trust and goodwill of this country. If they do so, I guarantee in 3 years they will get, with reason, anything they want, including financial, economic freedom, which I personally think they ought to have. Where does this letter sit within the strategy? In, I hope, my circular narrative today, it'll become clear that at least the links and avenues may or may not be significant. The Laverys were indeed part of a complex network. And I quote Frank O'Connor in his biography of Michael Collins, published while there was still access possible to those who had been part of those events. And he writes, and I quote, "Negotiations opened a new world to him, for it had been Childers, Barton and the Davies. Now it was Cope, Churchill, Birkenhead and the Laverys. And of course we can talk about in the Q&A the latter's relationship to the former. So the focus on Birkenhead socialising with Collins openly and the Laverys described as an unlikely friendship, of course, was done with the knowledge and understanding of the politicians, and it was part, I suspect, of a wider strategy. I don't have time to go into the details of some of the letters that passed between the next man that I'm going to mention, Alfred Cope, but again, if anyone's interested, I have copies here with me. So Alfred William Cope, Andy Cope, a civil servant, born in 1877 in Kennington. He would have been described in the circles in which he was moving as being of humble background. Sometimes in his exchanges with the Laverys, he doesn't really seem like a British civil servant. Sometimes in his exchanges we know that he had secret negotiations with Sinn Féin. So much of what we read about his negotiations overlap with the Laverys. And again, indeed, there's so many interconnections between the people and the friendships. We know that in and out of 5 Cromwell Place came Sir Shane Leslie, Winston's first cousin, Eddie Marsh. Philip Sassoon's house is given as the location where Hazel had public and somewhat embarrassing encounters with David Lloyd George. But I would remark here that she was an actress of some ability. His private secretary, Philip Sassoon, lent his office to the Irish delegation. And so what I want to do is focus on Sir Alfred Cope and his relationship with the Laverys and in terms of just raising this here. And John Lavery in 1925 had a painting of him that is now part of the collection of the Hugh Lane, which was bequeathed in Hazel's memory in 1935. So I want to conclude with a couple of comments. One, there is no biography of Cope, although he himself in the 1930s approached Dennis Gwynn, who you will know is the son of Stephen, who I just mentioned, the circular references I was talking about, who in turn married Lady Lavery's only child. Dennis Gwynn became Lady Lavery's daughter Alice's second husband. And so where are we looking for the sources for popular history? We've always looked to sources like the Bureau of Military History. And there's a very interesting letter, which I'm going to conclude on, about an approach that was made to Andy Cope to tell his story. And this is the letter that I'll quote. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's written, and the man that's mentioned in it, Mr. McDumphy, is the director, Michael McDumphy, BL. And I quote. It's slightly long, so I hope I haven't run too much over time. As to the enclosed, I'm sorry I cannot see my way to help. This is his contribution to the Bureau of the witness statements. Over the years, I've had offers from various sources for my views and experiences, but I have turned all of them down because I regard this period, and also that following the treaty, to be the most discreditable of your country's history. It is preferable to forget it, to let sleeping dogs lie. It is not possible for this history to be truthful, although I am sure Mr. McDumphy will do his utmost to make it so. The job is beyond human skill. The IRA must be shown as national heroes and the British forces as brutal oppressors. Accordingly, the truce and treaty will have been brought about by the defeat of the British by the valour of a small, ill-equipped groups of irregulars, and so on. What a travesty it will be, and must be, read by future generations of Irish children. It will simply perpetuate the long-standing hatred of England and continue the miserable work of self-seeking politicians who, for their own aggrandizement, have not permitted Christian values of forgiveness and brotherhood to take its place. Ireland has too many histories. She deserves a rest. Her present need is a missioner to teach her that love, not hate, is still the only password both to earthly happiness and heavenly kingdom. Please send my best and sympathy to Mr. McDumphy in his thankless task. Thank you.
So Caoimhe, Martin, Sinead, thank you all very much for those fascinating contributions. And we have, as I said earlier, a panel full of people, or not a panel, an audience full of people with deep interest in these issues. So although I have many questions, I could ask myself, I'm going to be a generous host and open the floor. And we're going to take 2 or 3 initial comments or questions from the audience, and that will open up discussion here with the panel. So raise your hands, please. And we have, and if you can also introduce yourself, we have Ronan, first of all, at the back.
Hi, Ronan McGreevy here from the Irish Times. Caoimhe, I have a very quick question for you. What is the provenance of the, quote, immediate and terrible war? Where did it first originate, and how many corroborative sort of accounts of it are there? Thanks.
Thank you. And in front of Ronan, we'll go to Ida for her question. Just wait for the microphone, Ida, sorry. Here we go.
Ida Segarra from Trinity College. I was very interested in a comment on Fermanagh and Tyrone, because my father, Kevin O'Sheil, was involved. But I never thought it was a starter at any stage. Could you say a little bit more about the possibility of actually bringing it to a break even? I mean, it's not historical, but it had to be 6 counties, didn't it, since 1914?
And we'll take a third one, which is from Daniel.
Daniel McConnell from the Irish Examiner. Martin Mansry, you obliquely referred to, I suppose, the decision of De Valera not to go to the negotiations in London. I suppose there's a bit of revision going on as to the wisdom or the impact of that decision. I suppose, can the panel, I suppose, illuminate us in relation to his manoeuvrings, not only, I suppose, in October, but also the presentation of Document 2 so late in the day? Thank you.
Good. So 3 rather diverse questions there, but touching on various aspects of the period and its controversy. Caoimhe, let's start with you.
So to take Ronan's question first, the exact phrase "immediate and terrible war" seems to have been given to the historical record by Robert Barton during the treaty debates. I think he probably said it first at the cabinet meeting following the signing of the treaty, but you know, that phrase does not appear in any of the records of the negotiations themselves. It was a verbal. I imagine that's the gloss that he put on it. Lord George probably said something like "war within 3 days," But what's striking to me is how quickly it enters into the national consciousness, because by the time of the treaty debates, many contributors are making reference to this fact that this ultimatum had been issued. And you get various kind of versions of it: terrible war, immediate and terrible war, war within 3 days. So there's all sorts of different incarnations of what it was. And so it's quite striking, I suppose, that we have this phrase, which, as I began my speech with, has entered the national lexicon, but the person who was supposed to have said it, we're not clear whether he actually said those exact words. It's an interpretation of what he is supposed to have said. So there's some complexity there in terms of the actual provenance, but it's not disputed, as far as I know, that a threat amounting to that, or words amounting to that, were delivered by Lord George. Do you want to?
I was just going to say on that, I suppose the key thing from the sense of the negotiating dynamics is, do you think if Lord George had not been able to issue that threat, and if the Irish delegation, or at least some of the Irish delegation, had not seen it as a credible threat, would the course of would the outcome have been different? Would the Irish delegation have refused to compromise on the sort of the oath and the Dominion status and accepting the Boundary Commission? Would they have fought on politically, or perhaps even fought on militarily, if they hadn't taken Lloyd George's threat seriously?
I think they would have brought the treaty. They wouldn't have signed. They would have insisted on referring back to Dublin, and then that would have brought about a whole other series of counterfactual events which we could have talked about. But I think the impact of those words, or words amounting to that effect, being issued on that night, was that they signed it without referring it back to Dublin, which of course, caused all sorts of problems in terms of the internal dynamics of the Irish, of the Sinn Féin movement. To come to Ida's question, so I'm of the view, and other historians may vary, but I'm of the view that it was quite clear from before the war, I agree with you, that some sort of provision for Ulster would have to be found. Now, whether that was going to mean 6 counties or 4 counties, whether it was going to mean an Ulster Parliament within an overall all-Ireland Parliament, those were the things that would have to be untangled, and those were the things that changed quite substantially in that intervening period. And it's quite interesting that, the people the members of the coalition government, including Lord Birkenhead, threatened to rip up the British Constitution in 1912 for in defence or in opposition to a Home Rule measure, when then they were part of a government that actually did enact Home Rule for both parts of Ireland in 1920 and then went farther again in 1921. So, talking about Fermanagh and Tyrone in 1921, in October to December 1921, of course the Northern Ireland Parliament is already up and running by that point. Now, we can talk about the Boundary Commission and the kind of the mood music around the Boundary Commission that was being given to the Irish delegation. I think there were some strong insinuations that the Boundary Commission would give so much territory to the Free State that Northern Ireland would become unviable. Although Lloyd George also does say some interesting things that, you don't want to... If you're thinking about the prospects for ultimate reunification, you probably don't want to have a tiny Catholic nationalist minority, because that will mean there'll be less of a route towards ultimate unification. But I think, for me, certainly, it's quite clear that some sort of provision for Ulster would have to be found. That's clear as in 1913, 1914. But not everyone came to see that in the same way. And I know there are other historians whose views differ. Martin, shall I let you respond to Daniel?
Just briefly on each of the 3 points. Of course, many of the most famous sayings in history, it's hard to pin down if they were ever actually said. I remember reading an article in a French magazine about 20 famous sayings, beginning with l'état c'est moi. If he said it at all, he said it about the age of 13, in 1652, Louis XIV. Anyway, but it doesn't alter the impact of the attributed phrase. And I think Caoimhe was right to focus on that. In connection with the Ulster question, now David Trimble, who is a sort of a historian, in fact he's a good historian, he respects facts and so on. He takes the view that Nationalist Ireland let Fermanagh Tyrone slip through their fingers, but in the 1912-14 period, rather than as late as the treaty negotiation. The trouble is there was such an objection in general principle to partition that it wasn't until too late that, if you like, people came down to the details. And of course, when your father came to the Northeast Boundary Bureau, in a sense, the horse had already bolted. I've often wondered whether, if it had been said sort of firmly, we're totally opposed to partition, but if there's going to be partition, it will have to be done on areas. But if that had been said early enough on, would that have caused unionists to rethink? I don't know. But again, I refer back to the Sean McEntee speech. He pours scorn on the notion that somehow or other Northern Ireland will be economically unviable, whether it's 4 counties, 6 counties, and I think we can see with the benefit of hindsight that is true. In the case of De Valera, it's always been controversial, his not going and leading the negotiations. He had a complicated strategy in mind. Whether we fully got to the bottom of it, I don't know. But the problem was, the disunity of, if you like, the leadership of the movement. As once they got to the talks, what do we do next? What compromises can we make, if any? you know, I think, as I said in my talk, I think, I mean, the mistake was, and this includes the delegates who went to London, I mean, it should have been thrashed out, and it should have been insisted on it being thrashed out, and that was to be done at home rather than to let the British government divide and then turn one side against the other and allow you know, the Free State, if you like, or insist that the Free State act as enforcers. Now, as has been pointed out, in 1938, De Valera made no such mistake when it was the ports and so on. I mean, he went over and led the delegation, the acting at arm's length. Now, obviously, like any party leader, he wanted to keep the movement and the party together, and he knew he had sort of hardliners with him. I mean, you know, one can understand that, but I mean, in the end, it didn't work.
Sinead, there's sort of one thing that comes out of this is there's almost like two axes to the debate that was had in the Irish delegation. There was the sort of the geographical qualification of partition, and there was the political qualification of Dominion status and accepting the oath to the king, even with the qualification about the Commonwealth rather than the Empire. In the sort of popular debate around it at the time in Ireland, were those two things weighed as equally? Because it seemed rather from your presentation, Caoimhe, that the fixation or the priority was more this question of Dominion status and external association, and almost partition was accepted as something that would need to happen, albeit as a transitional phase towards eventual unification. What was the sort of the broader political and social context for those two aspects being weighed?
I suppose my reading for a lot of the first-hand accounts in particular, and I think this is a really important thing to sort of understand, is that when we think about it as a partition or as counties or as a definition of, divisions or regions, a lot of the people, there was such a porous county division, so that, while you might have had somebody in Monaghan, they would have, they were coming from, the village, 5 or 6 miles away, across what was now and is now a border or a county border, but they didn't see it like that. They were neighbours, and so I think when a lot of the things were playing out in the political sphere, people on the ground were really taken by surprise. When it was brought into law, there's quite a lot of work that we still need to do into understanding about how many people just literally overnight left their home place, they abandoned the farm, didn't want to stay remaining, let's say, for example, working. There was a whole, around people who were in the national teachers, for example, and now what jurisdiction were they in, who was going to pay them. And so there was quite so much a lot of confusion in the aftermath of that for people on the ground and for their understanding. And I suppose what you see played out in the newspapers and what you see played out in sort of political circles and what was the reality for people's lives is quite different. And I think there's really, when they were seeing the Articles of Agreement or what was going to happen, certainly the Boundary Commission was supposed to sort that out. As we know, it barely changed. So some sort of additional study, and we're going to see quite a lot about that in the next couple of years. In a way, sometimes we sort of gallop on ahead into the next stage when we're looking at the treaty was very much a moment in time and very much about the debating in that moment. And I suppose when you talk about the treaty, and we've always talked about that, is the strategy and the planning and the what ifs and what's going to happen in terms of De Valera. I mean, the idea that he was even in Limerick accepting the freedom of Limerick when he hears that this has happened, and he's on he's in transit, he's on a train, and you get the sense of him trying to understand where was the last discussion that they'd had and how it had come to this within such a short space of time. And so a lot of the third and fourth and fifth hand accounts that are with us, and even for Barton, who lived on, and he was still giving interviews in the 1950s, they were very, very slow to be drawn on those days and give more detail. It's a sort of we have a different approach nowadays, when we want people to sort of reflect, and they were very measured about their memory and how faulty human memory can be. That's my feeling.
Talking of Barton, we have a Barton here in the audience. Bernard?
Am I right or am I wrong?
Yeah. Well, I can say from my personal experience of Robert, that he did not want to talk. I think he made that a rule even from the end of the debates. He did not want to speak. It was very painful, and he didn't want to speak about it, and pretty well was very, very measured in any comments that he made about it. The question I wanted to ask really of the historians in particular was this threat of war, even if in the sense in which we understand it, at loss, if you like, does that not in fact have to be seen in the context of the threats to war made in the Dáil debates on sending the delegation to London in the first place? I noticed from reading academic work that there's a lot of concentration on the debates and on what happened in London, but very little attention appears to have been paid, especially in the context of the subject we're discussing today, to the references to war in those debates which took place before the delegation went, in which a number of contributors basically said, unless we get what we want, we need to go back to war. And this was very public. And it seems impossible to me anyway, as an amateur, that Lloyd George wouldn't have been briefed about this. So I'd like to hear what perhaps a historian would have to say about that.
And talking of a historian, we'll pass to Patrick for his question. I'll just add a little coda to Bernard's. Watching the play, one of the striking things at the end of it is Michael Collins basically saying to his other negotiators, you know, we only have about 2,000 men. They only have about one rifle and one round of ammunition each. Our threat to go back to war against the British, you could deploy 100,000 people, is not credible. So there's the credibility of whether Lloyd George could deliver immediate and terrible war with a country that had been exhausted by the First World War and all the rest of it. And then there's the threat on the Irish side of could they mount any meaningful resistance. But while you ponder that, Patrick, the microphone comes.
Thank you, Patrick Egan, Trinity. First of all, to say a really excellent paper and some wonderful images, including the New York Times showing that even 100 years ago, they didn't like catchy headlines. And it was over 3 lines that they explained the story. But I'm just wondering, Caoimhe mentioned at the end contingencies and possible futures, and I'm just wondering, do the panel think that there's any kind of possible future that could have emerged that didn't result in a war that would have been terrible, maybe not immediate? Because option 1 was not signing the treaty, and there would have been a war, perhaps not immediate, but terrible. Option 2 is what happened, and it led to a terrible civil war. But option 3, even if in some strange universe where Lloyd George had conceded everything, including a 32-county republic and no oath or anything, that would almost certainly have led to some kind of immediate and terrible war between North and South. So it's hard to see a course of action or a path out of it that wouldn't have resulted without some kind of conflict on the island.
And finally in this round, Ulita at the back.
Ulita Clancy, and I'm here as a descendant, a granddaughter of Diarmaid Fawcett, who was one of the economic advisors on the treaty delegation. And I just want to thank you very much for wonderful presentations there and responses. I just wanted to go back again to the Ulster question, and you know that the delegation went over, and a big commitment was essential unity. And yet De Valera sent the Ulster position later in the day. They didn't have it with them when they went over. And I just wonder about how deep was that commitment in terms of they were saying to the British, look, let us sort it out between the North. We can do better. We can do that. But how much understanding did they have? And how much did Republican Ireland have, particularly of the Unionist tradition partition was already there, shall we say, but yet we abstained from Westminster when the Government of Ireland Act was going through, and it's arguable that that would never have gone through, even if we didn't have the numbers, if there was such a strong opposition from Ireland. And secondly, you know, why was there no Northerner on the delegation in terms of the plenipotentiaries? I mean, we had the Ulster Committee advising them with Sean Milroy over there, but Why was there no why did their commitment not go that far that they included a Northern nationalist as such in the delegation? And thirdly, one of the side issues of the negotiations, a very side issue, but it was there and it hasn't been drawn attention to much by historians, probably because there wasn't that much material. But I'm talking in a personal way, I'm talking about archives, and like Sinead, I had the honour and the privilege to see my grandfather's papers, which came to light only in the last few years. And in them was a file saying Peace Conference, Belfast, London, 1921. But there were also other papers which really excited me, and those were his reports of a special mission to Belfast, which De Valera had commissioned with Barton and the Economic Relations Committee. And my grandfather left 4 reports to the Cabinet. But not only that, in his papers are notebooks of the businessmen who were mainly unionists that he met with. And there had been overtures made by what we call moderate unionists who wanted to see friendly relations on this island. And that dialogue was going on. It went on after the treaty. Collins sent him, Griffith sent him again. So he had 4 kind of official missions, and then a final one where he was informally meeting some of them again. But just to cut it short there, that needs to be, that sort of personal and that primary sort of story, that was cut short by the Civil War. That dialogue could have continued because he intimated that he would be sent again. And, it's that kind of dialogue and listening process. I just feel, how much did we do, how much did we in the South do to try and understand the divisions in Ulster and understand the Northern, and we're still not doing it.
I was going to say a contemporary resonance as well. Maybe we'll go in reverse order this time, and I won't ask you to sort of answer all of those questions, but you pick as civil servants do when they sometimes appear in front of parliamentary committees, or indeed politicians do. You pick the bits that you'd like to answer. Sinead first this time.
Well, I suppose it's back down to the sort of the plea for the archive, and there's been a massive digitisation that's actually accelerate now again with the pandemic in terms of people's access to material, and I suppose the one thing that we found over years is that particularly if you're in a student capacity where you have to fund yourself, right? And so, the idea that you mightn't be able to get to regional archives within England, and so many of these families, scattered and went and took their papers with them. So there's always the hope that they'll turn up, but they, in some sort of, random digitization so that you might be able to turn up new material. But I suppose what I think in relation to what you're talking about is, again, it's to do with the focus and the documentation. So when something isn't current and when it isn't being discussed, people then don't actually give the material over to archives, and there's sort of that's, and it depends on where the interests are for historians, and then they generate more material. And so even the discussion today and to broaden it out, or to mention that and to talk about private papers is very important, because it then triggers, and hopefully you're going to bring something else to the fore, and it'll end up in an archive where it'll be accessible to the vast majority of people. So I suppose that's is the interest. And if you talk about the politician moment, what are you trying to do at any opportunity is to try and send a message out to people beyond this room. So I suppose that's the first thing. And also we're going to have a really interesting look when the 1926 census is going to come out, where we're going to be able to plot and look at it from the perspective of the family and the dispersal, and what we have as accepted history and the accepted canon, and what is actually going to show up when we analyse and look at that as a source. So we've had a huge interest in the area of family history that then informs the historical record. And I suppose the question in relation to the North and those what I would know particularly really well is women's material. And, we know a lot of the people who, the women who were pro-treaty, who would have been active in, and for example, Patricia Hoey was one of the people who was detailed during the period of the treaty negotiations to be preparing material on the North. But her papers don't survive. She died in penury. She was very disillusioned, didn't get a pension, and so anything that she would have had, she certainly wasn't going to be handing it over to any official source, even though she had remained pro-treaty and supportive of the Irish Free State. So that's another result of the Civil War. Not probably the most comprehensive answer, but the one that came to mind.
Martin, you spent a large part of your career as an official, as a politician, as an academic, thinking about the North and North-South relations.
I'll come to that, but I just want to make a brief comment about Collins and the military situation. One of the most memorable lines in the whole treaty debate is a statement by Owen O'Duffy, which is the best thing about freedom is fighting for it. And particularly in Munster, rightly or wrongly, the view of the military situation was not the perspective of Collins. Look, things are going absolutely right. They felt that they had, that the truce came as a bit of a surprise. They felt they were fighting it to some advantage. Okay, there had been pressure on people like Tom Barry. They were nearly surrounded in the spring of 1921, his flying a column. But so say, rightly or wrongly, they were quite confident of their ability to fight. Now, they could have been, totally unrealistic. People like Liam Lynch, certainly ended up that way, imaginary units, etc., the way sometimes, people right up to Napoleon, imagine that there are resources there that aren't actually there. Now, as far as the North is concerned, I suppose of all the major figures in the 1916-23, the person who had the greatest understanding of it, even if it was a partisan understanding, was James Connolly, of course, who worked in Belfast for a considerable period. And he certainly foresaw the discrimination coming and so on. But I think, for an awful lot of people, they had very little, if any, knowledge of the North. And if I can just, take the example of the units in Tipperary, it would oscillate from Sean Tracy shocked a Protestant member of Cumann na Món, a woman, when he said, all the Northerners need is, a bit of education and they'll buy into the ideals of Tone and Emmet and so on. I mean, that was one extreme. And then the others who just felt that, look, there was no significant Protestant opposition south of the border, that the North would be much the same. So I don't think a lot of thought was given to. You see, in a sense, 1916. I think it was a crucial moment because there was a decision to go ahead with the rising. Now, all right, the proclamation was in theory on behalf of a 32-county in Ireland. On the other hand, Connolly and Pearse gave orders there is no shot to be fired in Ulster. And, when Connolly was asked, well, what will happen afterwards, they said, well, we'll deal with the problem when we've gained control of the rest of the country. You see, I think by July 1914, it was clear that partition was nearly a fait accompli. And that therefore, the idea of trying to bring in Ulster Unionists wasn't going to. So in a sense, there was almost a sort of a mental writing off. And you see, and while, if you like, the nationalist Ireland was totally opposed to partition, in the end, in the treaty negotiations, it came down to where the treaty where the boundary was going to be drawn. But I think, again, there was sort of a lack of realism in, would the idea that a four-county North wouldn't survive. I mean, that was totally unrealistic. You see, and I think what they discounted, I mean, they were conscious of the connection, the importance of the whole island's market to northern business, and that was something real. At the time, what they were much less conscious of was the sort of the integration of the industrialized North, not merely into British markets, but the market of the empire. So I think, I mean, obviously, the decision was made from 1916 on is to go for an independent Ireland, and we'll deal with the North afterwards. So therefore, it wasn't the top priority. And of course, there were totally unrealistic psychological sort of calculations that, somehow if you burnt an Orange Hall in Dublin, this would help bring the Northerners to heel. Or, for that matter, the belief in among nationalists in Collins and De Valera, they were about to start on a campaign in June 21, according to Pierce Beasley, of sort of burning more big houses, on the idea that this would impress the British government. Now, I mean, as Churchill blurted out a bit later, they couldn't care less about the loyalists, the south of Ireland, So the idea that it would have an impression on them and affect the way these questions in negotiations would be dealt with, I mean, that was unreal. So, I mean, essentially, I agree with most of what you said in your question.
Yeah, but just to kind of follow on from that and to respond to your question, there were various very extreme and slightly implausible schemes to take the war onto a new footing from the IRA's perspective. Karl Brugge, Minister for Defence, had a scheme that he was very fond of assassinating the entire British cabinet. That's what he planned to do. And we know that there were IRA units in Newcastle, in Liverpool, in Manchester, in Sheffield. I hope that I'm going to, at some point, get a student to write their thesis on the IRA in Sheffield. And we know that, I mean, this is partly coming back to the archives question. We know this because of the pensions that these people had. So Brugge had this plan, which he wanted to see enacted, of assassinating the entire British cabinet. There were also discussions around the use of poison gas. So there are plans afoot, and they are thinking about ways to bring the war onto another footing, perhaps conscious of the point that you brought out, Paul, about how they don't have enough weapons, they can't, they've all these men, but they don't have enough weapons. So that's the first thing. I mean, the second thing is that we might see that scheme perhaps come to fruition 6 months later with the assassination of Henry Wilson, which does happen in London, which then sets in motion a whole chain of events which leads to the outbreak, the real outbreak of the Civil War. So I think on both the British side and the Irish side, a return to war doesn't mean to the same type of war that we had up until the truce of 1921. I think it's quite clear that it might have looked quite different on both sides, whether it's flooding with troops or whether it's going for more targeted assassinations. So that's quite interesting. In response to Patrick's question, which I think is a really good one, actually, if a bit of a depressing one, because I do think I agree with you that some sort of conflict was inevitable. I mean, historians pretend they don't like to use the word inevitable, but I think it was inevitable. And I think it was inevitable from the truce, because once there's the phrasing around the declaration of the truce, or the invitation to come to London, is to ascertain how the aspirations for the Irish Republic can be reconciled with the reality of the British Empire. It's some phrase along those lines that's in Lord George's letter of invitation to De Valera. And that word "how" implies a compromise. And once you're entering into negotiations, that means some form of compromise is going to happen somewhere. Now, I think some form of division in the Republican movement was always likely. I think De Valera, if the delegation had refused to sign, had taken it back to London, if De Valera had then, or taken it back to Dublin, if De Valera had then come over and negotiated himself, I think he might have been able to extract slightly better, but not substantially better terms. I still think there's going to be a split in the IRA. I don't think De Valera can hold the entire Republican movement together. I think if you look at De Valera's position during the Civil War, it's quite clear he doesn't have the sort of authority that many think he does. He's not calling the shots. There's a militaristic wing that take a very different attitude towards everything. Rory O'Connor and Ernie O'Malley and Liam Lynch and others. So But I think the minority opposing might have been a lesser minority and might have been less bolstered by political opponents on the treaty, like people like De Valera. So I think some form of conflict is actually probably likely, but I think it might have been less terrible than the kind of grueling and quite brutal civil war that and very bitter civil war that did ensue.
Just to say I agree with that.
And on that mildly optimistic note, that things could have turned out even worse, I'd like to thank Caoimhe and Martin and Sinead and all of you in the room and all of you watching for being with us for what will be the final Glencairn Conversation of 2021. But we look forward to having more of them in 2022. Thank you all very much.